What forgotten historic event should we teach in schools, and why? Not forgotten but not talked about enough, the Spanish flu epidemic. If I remember right, it was only called the Spanish flu because Spain was not in WWI, and therefore their media and health statuses were not being censored by their government. As such, they were the first to essentially report the epidemic despite it being elsewhere in European countries actively participating in WWI. Bit harsh to get the naming rights to it. Yup, you're right. They also were open about the symptoms and how devastating they were, something other countries were refusing to do. The US had a particularly bad moment after censoring the flu when Philadelphia allowed a parade to go as planned to promote buying bonds for the war. The first cases of the flu were already starting in the city, but hadn't been crippling yet. Within days after the parade, thousands were sick and the city had stopped functioning. In a month, over 4,000 died. It's estimated that 150,000 got sick and 12,000 died in Philly alone, making it one of the cities hit hardest by the flu in the US. The Bonus March of 1932, where tens of thousands of WWI veterans marched on DC demanding bonus payments, and were fired on by DC police and forcibly driven out by the US Army. 2 killed, over 1,000 wounded. Shows just how close the country came to the brink during the Depression, and it directly involved famous military figures like Douglas MacArthur. Whenever people say things like, but the military would never turn on the people in defense of certain political positions, I always like to bring this up. Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. I was absolutely shocked when I traveled to Cambodia and learned about it. Kind of ridiculous that I didn't even hear about it all in history class at school, especially because it happened like only 40 years ago. Pol Pot was still living a guerrilla existence in the mountains until about 1996. I was gobsmacked when he died. People from history aren't supposed to be on the news. His right hand Nguyen Shea died this Sunday. We should give more attention to the Armenian genocide of WW1 and the rape of Nanking, or at least in the USA the Second Sino-Japanese War in general, by the Japanese in WW2. Yeah, as a Jewish person I appreciate the extent that the Holocaust is taught, but not so much that the other atrocities at the time are seen as a footnote. I think you can expand that to all of Unit 731 during WWII. A lot of people just think Japan was bad because of Pearl Harbor and because they were allies with the Nazis, but the reality is that they were just as bad, if not worse, than the Nazis with their war crimes. The only reason it isn't talked about is because their headcount wasn't as high as the Nazis. It isn't talked about because USA helped cover the war crimes up. The emperor surrendered unconditionally in exchange for immunity. Also USA extended immunity and covered up a lot of the atrocities in exchange for research and lab data regarding Unit 731. This means the officer that led the people who committed the rape of Nanking would be immune from being tried, and many PM/politicians/government officials were allowed back into their former positions by the time Korean War started, as long as they were pro-American. The scientists and officers involved would be immune. Both America and Japan played up the atomic bombing of the two cities, and soon Japan became the victim of WWII. Many kids in Japan grow up thinking Japan fought in WWII to fight off Western imperialism, and many kids in America grow up thinking US is a big bad war machine because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As a result, you have a good portion of population that sympathize more with Japan than the very countries Japan raised. Only low-level war criminals were charged, which even the Shinzo Abe claimed were honorary veterans of Japan and not war criminals. By definition, Japanese government is the equivalent to what Germany would be if Germany as a country were Holocaust deniers. I'm not sure if this counts as an event, but the collapse and rebuild of China. It always seemed interesting to me. The Opium Wars, Boxer Rebellion, and China's role in WW2 are understudied in modern American HS curriculum. Bhopal disaster. The Halifax explosion. I think covering the biggest industrial accidents wouldn't be bad chapter to have in history books. Bhopal is heavily covered in every engineering ethics class. Its identical sister plant operated for decades in the US without issue. Atrocities committed by Leopold II of Belgium in Congo. When the other imperialistic powers take a look at what you're doing and take away your holdings on humanitarian grounds, that should tell you something. Yes. First time I ever of that was in a college course about European imperialism. The fact that over 1 million troops in the British Armed Forces in WW1 and over 1 million in WW2 were Indian. That includes trench warfare in WW1, battles in Italy in WW2. There were more Indians fighting for Britain than Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Caribbeans, and South Africans put together. Not seen this represented in a single war movie or in any of the textbooks at school in England growing up. For the US, the bombing of Tulsa and more focus on redlining and the like, as many people seem completely unaware of that. Are you referring to the Tulsa Race Massacre? Because if so, this topic needs to be brought up much more often. It cannot be forgotten. The United States generally doesn't do a great job of explaining or contextualizing the Japanese internment camps during WWII. When I was in school, admittedly 10 years ago, they were briefly mentioned, but it was almost an afterthought. I had to do research on my own, that is read a Wikipedia page, to actually get the lowdown on how/why they happened and what they were like to live in. It wasn't just Japanese Americans either. I think it's around 15,000 Italians were interned, and close to 600,000 were otherwise persecuted for their heritage. The Holodomor. 6 to 8 million Ukrainians deliberately starved to death under Stalin in the early 1930s. If you go to Ukraine, they took down a lot of communist symbols and history compared to somewhere like Belarus, which still retains much of its Soviet past. I believe Ukraine lumped communist imagery with fascist imagery and declared it a collective no-no. I love and support free expression, but those two isms killed a shitload of Ukrainians, so it's a little understandable. Scientific revolution in the ancient Middle East, as well as advancements in sciences and politics in Greek and Roman culture. Other places too, they just come to mind first. Science didn't just happen in Europe, the Middle East, at multiple points like Mesopotamian Bronze Age, and the Islamic Golden Age. The Indus River Valley civilizations and modern-day Indian territories had their own golden ages, not to mention the plethora of things we received from Chinese inventions. You like pasta? That's Chinese in origin. Compasses? Chinese. Gunpowder? Chinese. Algebra? That one is actually Arabic/Mesopotamian in origin. The fact that the U.S. seriously dabbled in fascism during the Cold War. The Red Scare was no joke. The government had blacklists and official strategies on how to socially ruin those the House Un-American Activities Committee deemed un-American. People were being subpoenaed before Congress, and we are asked if they were a communist, if they knew any communists/socialists, and had their right to work stripped in the U.S. If the House Un-American Activities Committee didn't think they gave a satisfactory answer. I think it's one of the reasons our country is so conservative today. We essentially purged the left from participating in America during the 50s. To preface, I'm not a supporter of the Nazis or their barbaric practices. They were responsible for millions of deaths and a systematic extermination of Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, Slavs, and more. They earned themselves their reputation. However, I feel that as bad as the Nazis were, the Soviets and Chinese communists killed far more people over a longer period of time, and that it is not nearly as covered in schools as it should be. Soviet pogroms and the Chinese Great Leap Forward were insane in their kill counts, and should be portrayed as such. For sure. I'd say that much of Russian history and Chinese history is left to the wayside in American schools. You hear bits and pieces of ancient China and maybe Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, but that's about it. Not a lot of information about more recent history. The 1953 Iranian coup d'etat. The CIA essentially controlled the Iranian media and used it to overthrow a democratic government so they could put a more agreeable dictator into power. This was a starting point for anti-Western sentiment in the Middle East and completely destabilized the whole area. We clearly still see the effects with groups like ISIS. The CIA literally killed democracy in an entire country. The bombings of Laos and Cambodia during the Vietnam War. No one really knows about it, and they are still suffering from it today. about 288 million cluster munitions, and around 75 million unexploded bombs were left across Laos after the war ended. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe.